accustomed to paying income tax, sales tax, maybe even property tax if you're a homeowner. But some North Carolinians may be subject to another kind of tax, a tax on their illegal drugs. Yes, it is true. We're not kidding. North Carolina imposes a tax on illegal drugs. And that is the subject of a new Carolina Journal column written by Brenee Goforth. Brenee is the newest member of the John Locke Foundation team. Brenee, welcome to Carolina Journal Radio. This is your first chance to be with us. Hopefully the first of many, many appearances on the show. Glad to have you.
Thank you for having me.
So how did you find out that North Carolina imposes a tax on illegal drugs?
Right. So I was writing a kind of brief from one of our researchers' pieces on the proposed hemp reforms. And so they're clarifying the status of hemp as not one of these unauthorized substances. And one of the things that was said just in passing was that it's no longer going to be subject to these unauthorized substance taxes. And I thought, wait a second, what are those? I need to know more about this. And so I did some research and I thought, oh my God, I have to write about this. This is so interesting.
And in fact, you did. And it's a really interesting column available at carolinajournal.com. So tell us about the tax. I mean, how much and how do they impose this?
Right. So the amount for the tax varies. And so the amount of each particular drug that you have to be subject to the tax varies as well. So for any kind of drug that's not measured by weight, it's 10 units of that drug. So say for something like Xanax, for something like moonshine, it's any amount of it makes you subject to this tax. And the way that it's supposed to work is it's based on how much of it you have. You go into a North Carolina Department of Revenue office and you say, hey, I'm here to buy a drug stamp. And this is how much drugs I have. Please, here's my money. Give me a stamp. And you're supposed to permanently affix it to your drugs, whatever that means.
Okay, so when we're saying illegal drugs, you mentioned a couple of them. Are we also talking things like meth, heroin, anything that's classified as against the law, not prescription medication, anything like that, but illegal drugs? So it really kind of boggles my mind to think that someone would walk into a state agency office and say, hi, I'm here to tell you that I am like a drug user or a drug dealer, and I want to be compliant with the state rules on taxes. That just sounds crazy, Brenee.
Yeah, it does sound crazy. And, drug dealers and drug users don't do that. They don't go into the North Carolina Department of Revenue office and ask for a stamp. Since the law was implemented in the 1990s, there have only been 109 orders for these stamps. And that's believed that most of those were from stamp collectors. So the way that the tax in reality is actually collected is after you get charged with a crime, you get your criminal penalties, you get whatever else, and then the NCDOR comes after you for back taxes. And so that is how most of this tax ends up being collected.
Now, that's a fascinating point because people who may not realize it because they're in the drug dealing business, for example, once they are caught by the cops, they also get a tax bill?
Yes, they do. So there's actually 3 different ways that you can be fined for a drug crime. The first one is the criminal penalty from the crime that you did. The second is any civil asset forfeiture, so any of your assets that are associated with the crime, money from the crime, automobiles, the house that you stored your drugs in can be taken. And then there's this third thing, the unauthorized substance tax, which is a third fine that can be imposed on you. So there's lots of different ways that you could be liable to the government after you've committed one of these drug crimes.
Do we know how much money this actually brings in for the state?
Right. So it varies, but the numbers that we have are between $6 million and $11 million a year. So that's not chump change. It brings in a good amount of money.
That is really fascinating. I'm wondering if some of our listeners might be thinking, well, wait a second, this sounds so unusual. Do other states do this? Do we know that? Or has anyone tried to challenge this in court?
Right. So a couple of other states have tried to do this, and this is not the first unauthorized substance tax. The United States actually did this back in 1937. They imposed a drug tax on illicit substances, and it was struck down in the late 1960s because they found that it violated the Fifth Amendment self-incrimination clause. It required you to give up your criminal activity, and therefore it wasn't constitutional. Tennessee did as well one of these taxes and found it unconstitutional. And North Carolina's tax originally didn't hold constitutional muster because the taxes were so high. The North Carolina Supreme Court said this fails the double jeopardy clause in the Constitution. You're essentially charging a person for the same crime twice.
Has anyone actually gone in and tried to go through the process just to experiment and say, I want to see how this actually works? I mean, you mentioned that there had been, I think it was 109 people who had applied for these types of unauthorized substance stamps, a lot of them stamp collectors, but do we have any personal experiences with this?
Yes. So just earlier this year, Jonathan Holbrook, who is a professor at the UNC School of Law, he went in to see if he could get one of these, if this was at all possible. And the answer is that North Carolina Department of Revenue offices do not carry these stamps. And so the way that you would have to get them is to mail in a form, which of course is not anonymity. That would be, a form of self-incrimination there, because in order to get the stamps back through the mail, you'd have to provide a return address. And so that's not exactly anonymous.
It would kind of be like, hey, Mr. Police Officer, come and get me if you apply for these things, right?
Right. And interestingly enough, they made it in the law. They tried to make it anonymous because the Department of Revenue, if anyone there discloses your purchase of a drug stamp to the police, they are guilty of a Class 1 misdemeanor.
Really?
So, yeah, that is supposed to keep it from, being self-incrimination. But the United States Postal Service is not privy to that. So if you have to send it through the mail, that's not a Department of Revenue officer who would be giving you up to the police.
Brenee, you are of the millennial generation and the newest member of the John Locke Foundation team. By the way, we are glad to have you here at the John Locke Foundation. Does it surprise you as you look at tax policy and have you talked to people of your generation about what North Carolina is doing?
Yes, I have. Everybody that I've talked to about it is so surprised. This is something that nobody's heard of before from my generation. And it is something that crosses generational divides in that we have seen the negative effects of the war on drugs and how it has been less than effective, not as effective as we would have liked it to. And for the incentives to be pushed in this way that the police get 75% of the money that comes in from this tax, that kind of incentivizes them to go after these drug crimes, which have proven to be an ineffective way to end, drugs in the United States. And to not go after maybe some sort of policing that would be better for the community.